everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons, and this is the bonus video for the July 2023 newsletter. Thank you all so much for being subscribed to my newsletters. I hope you enjoy the content. I know I certainly enjoy creating it. I really do put a lot of time into trying to think about what might be interesting, what might be helpful, and trying to be diverse in the philosophical ideas that I present to you. And so that said, today what I want to do for this video is think with you about a rather technical phenomenological idea, but I'm going to try to unpack it in ways that are maybe accessible and engaging for where we find ourselves in our everyday lives. What I want to talk about is hope, and specifically the phenomenology of hope as presented by thinkers like Jean-Louis Chrétien, Claude Romano, and Neil Deroux. So in order to think about hope, what we normally do, right, in our lives is think about hope as a kind of, anticipation of what we wish were the case, right? So we hope to go on that vacation, we do what we can to make that happen, and then we go on the vacation and our hopes are fulfilled. So hope in lots of ways, and in philosophy more broadly, it's often confused with an idea of wish fulfillment, right? We hope that P is in many ways the same as wishing that P would be the case for us, fulfilled in the sense of becoming actual. Well, I'm not really going to think about hope in that sense today, but instead I want to think about hope in the modes by which we relate to our future as narrating and impacting our conception of the present. In other words, how does hope shape who we take ourselves to be and where it is that we are trying to go in the sense of existential development? Well, Claude Romano is really helpful here. We're not going to go into the weeds of his thinking, but what he does is lays out different modes by which we relate to possible futures. And this is something that then Neil Deroux takes up in his excellent book on futurity in phenomenology, where he talks about anticipation. We are defined by a relationship to what is not yet the case. And this is in some ways a mode of relating to our future as projected from our present. Martin Heidegger, in fact, suggests that the future, or what we expect, or that towards which we strive, is in fact the weird condition for where we find ourselves. We occur in some way out of our future because it's in that orientation, in that directedness, that we take ourselves up where we are as projected, as oriented, as directed. I have worked on these ideas in my own academic philosophy for quite a few years, and I've developed what I think are a rather helpful set of 3 different notions of hope that can, I think, enliven how we make sense of our daily activities. And these are 3 different notions that are drawn from Romano, Deroux, Martin Heidegger, and also Jean-Louis Chrétien, who talks a lot about what he refers to as the unhoped for. And so meshing all of these together, again, without going into the weeds, I'll be happy to send you links to these technical articles if you are interested. Drop me an email and I will provide them for you. But what I'm going to do is offer what I take to be a helpful trilogy of types of hope, a kind of topology of hope, such that we can understand the phenomenology of what it looks like to live as beings who are defined by different notions of hoping. All right. The first notion of hope is what I'm going to call existentiel. And existentiel is a really, really unfortunate term, but I'm taking this from Heidegger. And existentiel is the notion that we are oriented toward hope, existential hope, when we hope for a particular or specific outcome to occur, for some specific discrete thing to become actual. So if I hope for a new job, I hope for a new car, I hope for a new relationship, I hope for a new phone, whatever it is, I'm hoping that X obtain, that X be the case. And in this way, my hope is discrete, It is in many cases material, and it is also something that can be understood as fulfilled and finalized once that hope has come to pass, once I get that object, once I have the phone, drive the car, occupy the job. Now, existential hope is, I believe, a kind of analogy with or an alternative to the way we make sense of fear. So when I am afraid of something. And so I might be afraid of snakes, like my wife is, or afraid of spiders, or afraid that I will lose my job, or afraid that my car will break down, or that my phone will die. Being scared of those things is a way of making sense of the phenomenon of fear as itself discrete, local, and something that we can articulate as occurring at a particular time. So existential hope corresponds to the reality of fear, such that I am fearful that these existential hopes may not come to pass. Right? And if they do come to pass, their occurrence is what then negates that fear. My phone stays alive, my car continues to run, the job continues to be present. Moving from existential hope, which I would suggest is the most like the kind of wish fulfillment that we spoke of getting started. This is the way we tend to think about hope, and in many ways, the only way we think about hope. And that would be a mistake, right? Because we might not just think about, wanting the new car. We might think about, wanting a car that runs 1 billion miles to the gallon and costs 3 cents. Well, this would be a hope that has no real chance of being fulfilled. And therefore, we could say that it's an irrational hope, right? So existential hoping, connected to very discrete realities and fears, are things that require us to be constrained relative to what is possible, what is reasonably able to be expected given what is the case today. Well, moving on from that framework, we could think about what I want to refer to as existential hope. And existential hope is different than existential hope because existential hope is not a hope for some discrete outcome, but is the hope that defines us as temporal beings in the first place. Existential hope is the hope for tomorrow. It is the idea that I can't narrate my identity, my very selfhood, without being grounded in hope for the next minute, right? It is not hope for a particular outcome in the future, but simply a hope that my temporal projectedness is something that continues in order that I can then narrate my life relative to specific existential hopes within that future towards which I am directed, right? So existential hope is the temporal fabric by which I make sense of my existence. I hope existentially in order that I can understand my life as a kind of journey, as a kind of lived experience. It's what allows me to be able to narrate the present as such, today as opposed to tomorrow. So when I say I am hopeful for tomorrow, this is not just an existential hope, which might be I'm hopeful for tomorrow so that it will be a good day mountain biking. I'm hopeful for tomorrow when I will be able to have dinner with my father. I'm hopeful for tomorrow because it's when I will be able to fill in the blank. It's not that kind of hope for tomorrow. Existential hope is hope for tomorrow as such, that tomorrow is. And insofar as tomorrow is, today is. That existential orientation is what Heidegger will talk about insofar as we are defined temporally. We are beings in time. We are temporal beings. This is, I think, analogous or correlative to a different kind of failure, a different kind of struggle. So if existential hope was correlative to the phenomenon of fear, where we were afraid of a particular outcome either occurring or not occurring, existential hope is correlative with what we might term anxiety. This is what existentialists from Nietzsche and Kierkegaard to Heidegger and Sartre all will talk about in different ways. And it's the idea that we are not afraid of a particular object, but we are aware of our temporal limitation. In other words, anxiety is the fact of our finitude weighing upon us. It's what allows us to make sense of the fact that we are limited beings because we do not live forever. So it's not a fear of death, right? It is instead the anxiety about the fact that all of my time is something that is significant and meaningful, and I've got to make the most of it. So what will I then do? That kind of weight, that sort of anxiousness. It's not relative to a snake or a spider or a loss of a job. It's because I am finite. And my finitude then means that every instant matters in really significant ways. And this can sometimes be a heavy burden to bear. So where are we? Existential hope is a hope for a specific outcome that can be externally located, right? It's a hope for tomorrow to be a space where I get that Porsche, I buy a new drum set. It is correlative to fear because we are afraid that that will not happen, or we are afraid that our future will be defined by the presence of snakes or spiders. Alternatively, existential hope is the hope for tomorrow as such, not for a particular way that tomorrow will look. It is what grounds us as beings who are temporal, and it is then correlative to the reality of anxiety such that our temporal existence is limited by the necessity of death. So we've got to make the most of the time that we have. But the time that we have is always framed by the existential hope for the time to come. Okay, those are the first two. The third is what I term eschatological hope. And here, the term can be kind of weird. It's got a theological overlay. But what I mean by this is I'm borrowing from the idea that the eschaton, or the end times in certain types of theology, is this weird paradox where something is already and is not yet, right? It's called the already not yet structure or logic. Why would I choose to talk about an eschatological mode of hope? Well, it's because this is what we sometimes refer to as hope against hope, or again, what Chrétien calls the unhoped for. It is hoping for what we might call the impossible. Now, contrast that with existential hope, right? Which was hoping precisely for what is possible in order that our hopes be rationally framed. That it not just become wish fulfillment in bizarre ways, that it actually is a kind of project that we can live into as beings who are temporally described by existential hope. Eschatological hope is saying, yeah, all that's true, but we are not limited by simply what is possible. We are these very strange, paradoxical beings who somehow live toward futures that are impossible from where we currently find ourselves. There's no way to get to there from here. I like to think about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech in this regard. When he says, I have a dream that X and Y and Z will occur, that racial equity will be the case. When he says this, he's saying this in the middle of a unbelievably complicated and horrific reality of segregation, of racism that was overt, of a civil rights struggle that was, of course, trying to stand on its own legs, that was trying to get off the ground to make possible the dream future that he presents. And yet he says, this is what I now narrate as the future. I'm claiming this in order that we today be able to live toward it. If we don't claim it as possible, even though it's impossible, it will never be the case. So eschatological hope is saying already now, in the midst of segregation, we are claiming the truth, the reality of racial justice. Eschatological hope is not an idea of trying to achieve a particular outcome. It's about living now in relation to what it is that we couldn't possibly envision except in our living into it. I know that sounds weird, right? I get that this is complicated. This is why, like I say, it took some hardcore phenomenological work to try to cash this out in my own authorship. But I think it's really valuable for us because we've got to find ways to live toward what seems impossible. And not just live toward it as, again, a hope that it will come about someday, existential, not just a general existential orientation toward, the next, whatever that might be, but as a specific narrative of the value of the present in relationship, as defined by what it is that we might otherwise abandon. And that's where I think the hope against hope becomes so profound. When we hope against hope, we are eschatologically hoping against the existential hopes that are rationally constrained by what is possible. In other words, it's where our orientation toward the impossible animates how we navigate the world, and it therefore changes and radically upturns what was possible, such that our existential hopes now can become more profound, more developed, and you might even say more virtuously performed. So in order to think about these three, I want to suggest that hope is not just wish fulfillment. It's not some silly idea. Hope is something that we navigate and we use to narrate our lives at all instants. What is it that we want to narrate our becoming in the first place? Who is it we hope to be? Not relative to job or car or phone, but relative to the future as space where others then will live out their existential hopes. What if we give them a different world? What if that world could be radically different than the world we currently inhabit? Can we find the fortitude to hope against the hopes that so often constrain our imagination? We have to find ways to live today such that what would otherwise be impossible now becomes already where we find ourselves. I admit this can be complicated. I admit that some of this is confusing and there's some technical discourse in play, but I hope that it at least gets you thinking, causes you to wrestle and to try to parse how these three different hopes play out in your life. Remember, when you are scared of some actuality, then that doesn't mean there is no hope. It might simply mean that your existential hope is facing some challenges, but we are still hopeful for tomorrow, existentially. When our awareness of finitude gets overwhelming and our anxiety threatens to destroy even our existential hope, eschatologically, we realize that we are paradoxical beings for whom the impossible is ultimately not something to be worried about, but it's something maybe to propel us in imaginative ways towards what we couldn't even envision without living already into it as the vision that names us. So drop in comments, think with me about these different notions of hope. If some of them aren't clear, let me know that so I can try to clarify for you. All right, here we are in July, looking forward to the remainder of the summer. I hope yours is rocking. I can't wait to see you again when we start into August. Let's stay in touch. Take care. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.